Was this the humiliation for Iran that it was widely presented as in the Western media by Israel and so on? Of course, I'm talking about the Israeli and unprovoked and completely illegal attack on Iran, just a fact, followed, of course, by the also illegal US assault, which followed. The original narrative looks a little bit shaky now after leaked Pentagon assessment suggesting that actually it's not, it may only have set back Iran's nuclear whatever program by a few months, which is not actually significant at all. And Israel, as Donald Trump pointed out, got a bit of a kicking, actually, if we're going to just be honest, and I'm not saying it in a flippant way, because I'm not a fan of missiles, just generally be blowing people up, which is why Israel shouldn't have attacked Iran. There's no better person to speak to than so what I've been following about Iran, particularly Iran-related issues, not exclusively, which is Sina, who's senior fellow at Center of International Policy, a think tank based in DC, who writes very, very extensively on Iran and knows about Iran, unlike a lot of people pontificating about Iran. That's helpful. I don't know, it kind of helps people, someone knows what they're talking about. It's great to see you.
Thank you for having me. Really happy to be on.
I just want to ask firstly, this quite extraordinary, I mean, I say quite extraordinary, Trump having his latest thing. I mean, we shouldn't, I mean, you know, we're kind of used to a bit of theatre there, aren't we, really? But he, this was earlier where he was very frustrated that the basically leaked Pentagon assessment of the attack, basically into the Iran strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, basically. About and his defense secretary Pete Hegseth also just jumping up and down saying this, you know, but actually even there sounds a bit of doubt, moderate to severe, and we believe far more likely severe and obliterated. Well, there's a moderate and obliterated. It's quite a big gap between the two. And he says they're much further away from nuclear weapons today than, well, it depends how we define that. What do you think about that? I mean, because they don't sound that confident, actually. They're not, they sound a bit shaky given they are defined by bluster and how they present themselves. What do you think about the strike?
Yeah, I think when it comes to assessing this war and which side made strategic gains or not, first, I think it's useful to look at what Netanyahu said at the outset of this war and during the duration of this war as to his objective. So he said, you know, like a direct quote, like, we will not stop until we've destroyed Iran's nuclear and missile programs. And that was echoed throughout the conflict by various Israeli officials. We also saw that this kind of morphed pretty quickly into a pretty explicit aim to kind of trigger regime change or massive unrest and chaos in Iran. Netanyahu desperately talked to he went on this Iranian Farsi news channel, Iran International, which is most likely funded by Israel itself. And, you know, he tried to speak to the Iranian people and, you know, all these efforts to kind of stoke unrest. So now we see, you know, with this conflict reaching a ceasefire in this fashion, Iran's ballistic missile capability was not destroyed. Far from it. Iran was continuously firing missiles at Israel every day. I've seen compelling analysis from, you know, arms experts and missile experts and people who track that stuff very closely that Iran actually got situated in a pretty ideal situation with its missile strikes, that it initially fired heavy barrages and, you know, to really diminish the quantity of Israeli interceptors and their multi-layered air defense system. You know, it's the Iron Dome, it's the David Sling, it's the various Arrow interceptor missiles for high altitude, and they're the most important ones when it comes to these sophisticated, you know, hypersonic claimed Iranian missiles, which they are going very fast. They have multiple warheads. And so we saw that actually, interestingly, despite the number of missile firings going down, the number of hits went up. And, you know, there's a lot of footage of Iranian missiles hitting various facilities in Israel and targets. Iran, with that said, it seemed like they followed a pretty calibrated tit for tat response, where Israel, for example, hit, you know, an Iranian refinery with a drone attack early on in the war. Iran followed the next day and hit a refinery in Haifa, which resulted in that refinery going out of commission, power outages in Israel. I believe it's still out of commission as well. We saw that they attacked research centers and science centers in Iran, assassinated a lot of nuclear scientists. Iran bombed the Weizmann Institute in Tel Aviv, which is a top Israeli military research and scientific center. And then when it comes to the U.S. role, obviously America supported Israel, behind the scenes, military supply and all that, but they directly intervened on Saturday and bombed the Iranian nuclear facilities. And so this was also interesting because what it seems to me is that America bombed facilities that were largely evacuated of the key nuclear material, like centrifuges and enriched uranium. And then Iran retaliated by attacking a US base in Qatar that was largely evacuated. Again, calibrated tit for tat. So now when it comes to assessing the damage done to the Iranian nuclear program, so the biggest proliferation risk of Iran's nuclear program was that it amassed a large stockpile of enriched uranium, enough for, I believe, 10 to 15 nuclear bombs. Uranium enriched to like 60%, which is very close to the weapons grade 90% needed to weaponize. And Iran had gained, built these advanced centrifuges, what's needed to produce this enriched uranium, and centrifuges that could very rapidly produce high quantities of high enriched uranium. So according to this U.S. intelligence estimate that came out, according to the New York Times' coverage of this yesterday, there was a direct quote that said nearly all of this material and equipment is untouched, has been moved. And so I think, and that the Fordo, this deeply buried site that was targeted, that is the main facility in Iran, it seems like the Iranians themselves had said that only the entrances were hit, no damage was done. And even before the entrances were hit, there was satellite imagery of tons of trucks at the site in the preceding days that moved equipment out, and the Iranians themselves sealed it up with soil. Now, this New York Times report and this U.S. intelligence community report seems to corroborate that Iranian narrative that only the entrances were hit, that the underground halls that are, I think, hundreds of meters underground were not affected. And so this is a very damning indictment of this whole war. And, this idea that Israel is coming out of this having met any of its strategic objectives is objectively false, that Iran's missile program is not destroyed, its nuclear program is not destroyed. To the contrary, Israel actually suffered immensely from attrition warfare. Most of its citizens were in shelters for this 10-day period. Its economy was shut down. Key sites were hit. I heard from a Wall Street Journal reporter that, contrary to what the Israelis publicly acknowledged, key military and intelligence sites in Israel were also hit, and the Israelis were reeling and basically wanting more US help. And so this was also a costly war. I mean, for all sides. Certainly Iran took heavy blows. Its top military leadership was assassinated. Many nuclear scientists were assassinated. Many various targets in the country were hit. Its air superior, its kind of control over its own skies was challenged. Although I would say that this idea that Israel had total air supremacy is not supported by all the facts. Iran, for example, shot down many Hermes drones. We'll see if they shot down any jets and they have any proof of that, particularly the F-35. If they did, that would be a strategic game changer. But yeah, so we're seeing that. I don't think that the US and Israel would have accepted a ceasefire or agreed to one if their narrative was true. They haven't achieved any of their goals. So I think the mere fact that this ceasefire has happened after 12 days, after a surprise Israeli attack, is testament to the war being costly for them. And I think the Iranian strike on Al Udeid and Qatar, yes, it was symbolic. The base was attacked. Maybe no damage was done. But what it signaled is that Iran is willing to enter that theater of destabilizing the Persian Gulf states, these close allies of the US, this vital artery of global energy resources, the Strait of Hormuz. And, when it comes to economies like the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, much like Israel, which is another reason this war was costly for Israel, is that they're heavily dependent on foreign investments and foreign capital, and they heavily stand to lose from capital flights. This is the reason the Houthis emerged from the brutal Saudi war against them for many years, because they had managed to shut down large parts of Saudi Arabia for a while, and the Saudis just, they couldn't develop, they couldn't deal with that. So, and, Trump was just in these states inking these billion, trillion-dollar supposed memorandums of understanding. He has a lot of personal investments and personal wealth in these countries as well, as does Jared Kushner, for example. So I think, there's all these factors that contributed to the ceasefire. We'll see if it lasts. But for now, I think this conflict has been costly for all sides, but certainly the U.S. and Israel I don't think it could be credibly claimed that they came out of this meeting their strategic objectives.
I mean, what do you think of what Donald Trump said? Is in terms of, I mean, there was a few kind of aspects to it. I mean, in terms of publicly reprimanding Israel, saying it must not bomb Iran, and demanding it didn't drop the bombs on them, and doing that publicly. We know there have been tensions between the US and Israel before, actually more tensions. For example, under Reagan, notoriously during the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, when he rang the then Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to denounce the assault on Lebanon as a Holocaust. But he did that privately and didn't say anything publicly. But I mean, there's that. I thought one of the most notable things was he was talking about, because from the position of Israel, Iran is this great evil, it's the unique evil. And Donald Trump put them on the same level. He's talking about these two countries and put them on the same level playing field. But Israel is supposed to be essentially the closest US ally, pretty much. And Israel is supposed to be, Iran is like the great evil for the US, right, and the US as well. So he was saying about, these two countries, they've been fighting so long, they don't know why they're still fighting. As though they're both, naughty school children on the same naughty step. Which, from the point of view of Israel, is that's a huge improvement from where they are. For Israel, that takes them down astronomically, surely. And then, he keeps talking about how actually Iran did actually do quite a lot of damage to Israel. Which is not helpful from Israel's point of view at all. I mean, Israel tried to suppress reporting of what was happening in terms of the bomb attacks, the missile attacks. What do you make of that? Is it just theatre, or does it mean something? Because it's definitely odd. It's eccentric, not least actually given, I know people go, well, Trump's a maverick and all the rest of it, and actually you can't, he's unpredictable. But I mean, he did appoint a bunch of pro-Israel maniacs to key positions. So how does it all work?
Yeah, I think it's potentially extremely significant. We see that. I think it helps to take a step back and see what are the strategic aims of Israel in the region and what are the strategic aims of Iran, for example, in the region. Israel has basically positioned themselves as a key strategic ally for America, a valuable ally, during the Cold War against the Soviets and in the war on terror against Islamicism. And, despite the fact that they've been a strategic liability, I've argued, for America, they've been pushing to make themselves to continue to be on the receiving end of unconditional US support. And now with the global geopolitical landscape changing even more rapidly towards multipolarity, towards America not being overextended, America needing to prioritize certain regions over the other, that I think in this big strategic picture, Israel's priority has been to keep America in the region, keep it to back Israel unconditionally, support, give cover for Israel's expansionist aims over the West Bank, over Gaza, over other neighbors, to consolidate this apartheid order. I think that's a fair and objective assessment of Israel's strategic aims. And I think, their opposition to, for example, the Obama era nuclear deal was not because of its non-proliferation merits, which were very strong. It sealed off Iran's pathways to a deal. It was that they were afraid that America and Iran would eventually come to some kind of strategic settlement, that this big boogeyman of Iran that they built, that America would come to some level of terms with it, reduce its presence in the region, move on to focusing on China, Russia, other parts of the world domestically, and that Israel would strategically become in a more weaker position. So we see that Trump, like Obama, they've had this professed aim to, pivot to Asia, pivot to China. China's America's real peer competitor. And I think there's a lot of alarmism there. I'm against this new Cold War against China myself, but this is the view in Washington, that China is where America should focus, Russia. Yeah. So you can, in the Washington foreign policy establishment mindset, this is great power competition. China and Russia are America's great power rivals. Those should be the priority. Israel has been trying to portray Iran as some kind of big boogeyman, great power kind of country, which it absolutely is not. The Iranian economy is not anything significant or meaningfully challenging at a global level to the US. Its military power is purely defensive, as we've seen in this war. Even there's been Pentagon assessments, publicly released Pentagon assessments that Iran's military doctrine is defensive. It's based on asymmetric warfare. It does not have any offensive capability. It could basically, it's heavy investment in missiles, drones, certain other, these groups in the region that could raise the cost of conflict against it, but do not position it as an offensive power. So for America, it does make sense to come to some kind of strategic settlement to Iran, a détente, if you will, not like rapprochement. I don't think that's been on the table for either side. A détente that allows it to diminish its presence in the Middle East and focus more on Asia and Russia, elsewhere at home. So this war, in terms of meeting those strategic objectives, in terms of Israel wanting to get America into a war with Iran, Trump had just finished 5 rounds of negotiations with Iran right just before Israel attacked. He had written a letter to the Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in March, starting these negotiating process, which is apparently a very respectful letter. It seemed like Steve Witkoff was on the cusp of an initial framework nuclear deal that was potentially going to be reached in the talks that were scheduled for last Sunday before Israel struck the war. So, in Washington, there's basically 2 schools of thought. One is that, Trump basically deceived the Iranians. This whole thing was a strategic ruse. He was playing kind of 4D chess, meanwhile preparing and to support this Israeli attack. The other school of thought is that no, that Netanyahu's desperate to scuttle this process. He basically came to Trump. He's been pushing hard for attacking Iran for many months now. We know that all these reports preceding this that Trump was pushing back. He even apparently fired Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, because Waltz was gung-ho on attacking Iran with Netanyahu. But then it seems like there was this artificial 60-day deadline that Trump had apparently put on negotiations with Iran. It's not even clear when they started, when it would end. And it seemed like Netanyahu came to Trump the week this war started and was basically like, we have this plan, we're going to execute, we're going to take out their leadership, we're going to take out their missile, and then they sold Trump on this idea that this would make it easier for you to get a deal and it would put Iran in a weaker position and give you leverage. And then Trump seems to have given like a green light, if not a yellow light. And then that first morning when the Israelis were remarkably successful, I think Israel's comparative advantage in really warfare is these abilities and capabilities in intelligence, covert warfare, assassinations. This is an air power. This is what they've honed in on. They're not a ground power. They can't sustain conventional warfare for long periods of times, but their intelligence and covert means are very sophisticated, obviously with US and European support as well. So then that first morning, Israel came, took out Iran's senior military leadership, took out a bunch of nuclear scientists, and it seemed like they had kind of paralyzed Iran's air defenses and military command and control structure for several hours, because that's how long that lasted. And Trump that morning, it seemed like he was probably like, wow, this actually might work. And he had, he tweeted, he gave statements like, this is excellent, I support this. And then he kind of, once that first Iranian missile strike came, that later that day, he went silent, interestingly, for 2 days. And then after that was this push for this kind of incoherent push that eventually resulted, for escalation, de-escalation, that eventually came to the ceasefire. So I think ultimately it's very interesting, what you mentioned about this even-handed way that Trump addressed Iran and Israel when announcing the ceasefire. It wasn't like our great ally Israel, this evil country Iran. It was very even-handed when he was announcing the ceasefire, and that is, I think, the Israelis' worst nightmare. Is that if America adopts a more balanced role in the Middle East, similar to China and Russia, like China and Russia come deal with the Iranians, deal with the Saudis, deal with the Israelis. They don't give any of them unconditional support. They don't underwrite any side against the other, and they kind of gain leverage over all the countries. They encourage, They boost their leverage by having competitive foreign relations. So the Saudis have to compete with the Qataris over getting China's favor or getting Russia's favor, or the Turks have to compete with them to get, Russian favor. So if America were to have such a policy, well, rather than unconditionally backing any side in the Middle East, having a more balanced policy where it would encourage regional countries not to act with impunity that would entangle America into conflicts that it cannot afford, nor does it want, like a big war with Iran. And it can gain leverage over all countries. And ultimately, I would argue it would benefit America's strategic interests more in American security and prosperity to have better relations with Iran. And this would be the worst case scenario for Israel. So I think that's what we should watch out for going forward. If America continues to seek some kind of deal with Iran, we'll see what is even possible at this stage, especially given obviously the Iranians have every reason to be distrustful. Interestingly, Trump, when he announced the ceasefire, he also said China can buy Iranian oil. It was unclear what he meant because there's sanctions and China's not technically, according to US sanctions, not allowed to buy Iranian oil. Today at the NATO summit, Trump said that he linked ending the Gaza war, which he said there's been great progress made. Something may happen very soon, which we've heard before. We'll see. Nevertheless, he said that at the NATO summit, and he explicitly linked it to the Iran-Israel ceasefire, which that raises questions. What were the conditions of this ceasefire with Iran? Did Iran ask for it also to result in a Gaza ceasefire, or, so I think there's several things, the strategic landscape can change. Obviously, in Israel, it would want it to change and to enable its uncompromising dominance in the region, to keep America there, to contain and isolate or collapse Iran. But we're seeing, almost 2 years after October 7th, and now after this Israel-Iran war, that Iran is still there. Its military capabilities are still there. Its nuclear infrastructure is still there. And then Hezbollah is still there. Hamas is still there. Meanwhile, Israel is unprecedentedly isolated. I would argue they're in a strategic deadlock with what they've gotten themselves into with the occupation, with the West Bank. The Arab states aren't engaging them anymore or have an interest in deepening ties like they used to. America continues to want to leave the region. So I think they're in dire strategic straits. We'll see how it plays out, but the public narrative is not reflective of this, because that's reflective of the lopsided information war capabilities, that the US and the national security state in the US and Israel just have a lot more sophistication and power in the media space. And, alternative media such as yourselves and, non-legacy media are changing that. But in general, in the information war and what they can present a strategic failure as a victory much more than any other kind of power really can.
I mean, just finally then, I mean, that's interesting. Do you think, because we have heard this about Gaza several times now, and that being, I mean, well, they broke a ceasefire, which then Israel violated repeatedly and then just destroyed in what has been awful genocide. I mean, it's all genocide and depravity, but every day massacring, starving Palestinians at 8 points. So I'm just wondering what you think there in terms of what possible progress could be made, given the US has officially endorsed a policy of removing every Palestinian from Gaza, and the kind of prospects of what making Gaza a habitable place, how would that even happen in the current context? Because that would need colossal willpower with no restrictions. So you just kind of think, what does it look like, Gaza? I mean, it would be like the mother. I mean, it would just as Donald Trump said, a civilization has been wiped out. It's been wiped. I mean, what do you think? I just don't know what it looks like, because I just think we did the ceasefire thing with Israel just killing lots of people and then ending it when they wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, it'll have to be, Netanyahu would have to go, basically. He has, I think, undisputably, even within Israeli politics, that prolonged this war to ensure his own political survivability, to avoid all the ramifications that would come if he loses power, including on corruption charges, including potentially having to go to jail.
But it's worked. I mean, he might call a snap election and he might win.
Yeah. So that's why I think, he's trying to manipulate all these narratives to portray himself as ascendant. So even, for example, you had the US intelligence reports yesterday saying this strike on the nuclear facilities was basically a failure. Then you had this Israeli institution that I just read from this tweet from a former Israeli national security official who said that this Israeli institution has been heavily politicized and controlled by Netanyahu and his acolytes. So I think even within Israel, he's trying to push this narrative that, this war against Iran was a remarkable success. Against Hamas, we're going to destroy them, uproot them, they're over. But I think, yeah, it basically has to do with US pressure at the end of the day. If Trump, he's been all over the place. He has on important, significant issues differed with Israel in recent months. For example, saying he's going to lift the sanctions on Syria, deepening ties with Saudi Arabia, detached from Saudi Arabia, getting an Abraham Accord with Israel, directly negotiating with Hamas to get an American-Israeli hostage released over Israel's preferences, ending this war with the Houthis against Israel's preferences. So Trump has, already on these big issues showed that he's willing to, differ with Israel. So we'll have to see that, because I think America's strategic interests demand an end to this war. And we can see that the cost of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been at the root of a lot of the instability in the region, has been something that has entangled America in this region. And as the world global order shifts to more multipolarity, as America has commitments in other regions that it is struggling to maintain, it can't afford to continue backing Israel like this. So I think if Trump, just like Trump, yelled at Netanyahu and basically cussed them out yesterday, that ended the war with Iran. He also has that power to end that war in Gaza. And I think so if it ends, and if it ends in a way that can actually bring relief to the Palestinian people there, it would have to be because America put the pressure that it was always able to put. And that war has reached a dead end strategically. Just another quick point that I just remembered in regards to the calculations of the US is these interceptor missiles. So the Arrow interceptor missiles are very expensive. America produces them. America only reportedly produces about 100 a year. Those have already been depleted. Israel had I think between 100 and 200 that have been largely depleted. And so this is a big advantage to China. And China has a lot of the rare earth materials as well to produce these very sophisticated interceptors. So in terms of the balance of power in Asia, the balance of power in Russia and Eastern Europe and the Baltic area and Ukraine, these kind of armaments are key. And so America doesn't want to expend them in a useless, pointless war against Iran that is not in its interest at all. So I think, yeah, the strategic picture is not in favor of Israel. But with that said, I would not underestimate Netanyahu's madness. I mean, I used to think it was a madman doc. I don't know. He is very desperate. It's not just the show. Like he might just. I think if he launched this war to derail U.S.-Iran negotiations and get America in a big war, he might do something like that again. I mean, he's very desperate. So if to the extent that Trump understands this is unclear, a lot of the right wing in America increasingly understands this, including Steve Bannon, Tucker Carlson. So that narrative is changing. So I think, yeah, all these developments are not good for Israel.
Really, really fascinating stuff. And I think I hate that expression, dust has settled, but I can't think of another one off the top of my head. The narrative has shifted quite significantly, actually, even in the last 24 to 48 hours in particular, I would say. Because during the onslaught itself, it was just basically Iran is getting a kicking, humiliation, Israel, triumphant. But things have shifted, and actually it's not looking at all that straightforward. And actually, I think it raises very, very interesting question marks, which you have emphasized. So that was really, really fascinating. For everyone watching, do press like, subscribe, leave comments, leave your thoughts, share the video. Obviously, we want to get the discussion out, but it is important people hear what Sina has to say. I learned a huge amount there, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. So thank you so much, Sina. I really, really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.